This is a first roundtable this afternoon, connecting China in perspective. We have 4 speakers who will briefly outline a bit of their work and research and some positions relative to the symposium thematic. Our first speaker is Professor Wang Qingsong. She's a professor of women's studies, professor of history, in literature, science, and the arts, and a research scientist at the Institute for Research on Women and Gender in the office of the Vice President for Research. Professor Zheng is an internationally recognized activist for women's rights in China and gender studies globally, and provided me my first introduction to let's say Chinese space through the perspective of gender and its politics. So the image there is your younger sister, is that your sister? And here, so welcome. Yeah. Would you like to make some remarks? Please.
Website I want to talk about.
Sure.
Well, thank you, Fang, for inviting me. And when I came here, I instantly realized that I'm an oddball here because I'm not doing art. Everybody else is doing art. But somehow, the topic I want to present today is kind of relating to performance in a sense. That is the subject of my talk today. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of the Feminist of Five in 2015. Anybody raise hands? Oh, quite a few of you. Yeah. So let me go back a little bit. Robert has already kindly introduced me. I'm a historian of modern China, and my special field is women and gender in modern China. My own research almost entirely focused on the history of Chinese feminism, starting from the late Qing dynasty, early 20th century, around the turn of the 20th century up to today. And I'm a historian, but somehow I'm not content to just write about history. I also want to do history, so that makes me an academic activist. You could see from the picture Robert showed you, I was an activist before I was a conscious feminist activist. That was 30 years ago, when the students in Beijing started this movement. And I was here at the University of California in Davis as a PhD student. Then I couldn't sit there watching TV anymore. I had to join them. So I took the students' donation and flew to Beijing. And that's how I got a bunch of pictures. Last time Robert asked me to talk to his class, so I showed a few pictures, and as an artist, he got these creative ideas, putting me in front of that picture. So now today, Carol did another picture of me. I said, okay, that's a record of my aging process. 30 years, exactly 30 years. So after I escaped and returned to the US, I continued my PhD, and also realized that students' democracy movements was crushed there. Tanks sent into the square. So Chinese students in this country, everybody should have this deep sense of responsibility to carry on whatever they couldn't do anymore. So that's how I started. And also at the moment I mingled with all these guys, then I realized, oh gosh, they're talking about the fighting for democracy, but actually everybody was a sexist. in their own way. So I thought, okay, no, I'm not mingle with you. I have to launch a feminist revolution. That's how I started my own feminist organization exactly 30 years ago by a bunch of Chinese PhDs in this country. And then we all kind of became academics. Actually, I kind of didn't go to teaching position for a long time. I just got my PhD and go back to do my feminist activism. Later, I joined University of Michigan faculty. But anyway, so my 2 books in English is all about the feminism. It's a history about feminism. One is the first one, that's my PhD dissertation turned into a book, is about feminists in the May 4th period. I fortunately interviewed a group of older women who were feminists in their youth. They were born 1900s. Okay, at the time I got my good fortune to interview them when they were still alive. And then my second book was about those feminists who joined the Communist Party and joined the Communist Revolution in the early 20s and 30s and the 40s. And then when the Communist Party took over the state power, they became top leaders, but not in the male-dominated power center, but in Women's Federation. Okay, they were working for women's rights, and they worked very hard and encountered a lot of barriers. So that's that generation feminists I was write about in my second book subject. But besides writing this history of feminists, also in my activism, have been going back to China every year and running projects there. So I got to involve myself involved in a lot of feminist projects, activist projects, and formed a larger circle of friends who are feminists in different generations. My own work mostly is to train university faculty members to promote women's and gender studies in higher education. So I have a lot of students. They are students, but actually they are not students. Now they're all like deans of schools, professors, all that kind of type. However, I'm not sure how much you have been follow the drastic deterioration of political environment in China, okay? Especially since Xi Jinping came to power. So the first signal that they already started to close down social space for activists like us. And so starting from 2005, 1 decade after the 1995 the 4th UN Conference on Women, Chinese feminists started to pioneer NGOs, non-governmental organizations, created a lot of NGO activities and organizations. For a decade following the 1995 UN Conference on Women, that was legitimate, it's okay. So we all thought, okay, we have kind of safe zone for us to work on promoting women's rights. But then in 2015, 5 young feminists, when they just were in the same WeChat group, at the time we still use WeChat, we thought that's safe. We still use WeChat to communicate, to launch all kinds of stuff, activism. So they were young feminists, they're proposing, saying that for this International Women's Day, March the 8th is International Women's Day, we should do a public, activity to call awareness of sexual harassment in public transportation. Pretty soon you will see that they were not the first to do that, but they decided to do that. Oh, great idea, that's wonderful. But then before March the 8th, on March the 7th, all these activists, they were arrested, okay, they were detained. And it's a national action, it's not a local police did something. It's national, they were all arrested from Beijing, from Guangzhou, from Hangzhou, and then they were all sent to Beijing in the detention center. So these are the local feminists in China put on the masks from the pictures of these 5 feminists who were detained to mobilize support, public support, to demand their release. And also, we are here, when I was still here at the time, and we also mobilized global support. We had 2 million people all over the world signed their petition demanding the Chinese government to release them. So after 37 days, they were released. So it was a successful mobilization. So what my focus today is to talk about these young women, okay? These young women, when they came into picture, when they started to engage in feminist activism, that was already, I think the earliest one was public performance. They used public performance to voice their demands, their concerns, their issues. That was in 2012, okay? And these young women, you all know Chinese one-child policy. And we all heard a lot of horrible stories. Of course, the one-child policy was totally disastrous and also violation of women's rights. However, there's one bright side. That is, we got a whole generation of princesses, single daughters, okay? So historically, we all know that Chinese feminists, they always give preference to sons. We have son preference. That's why you have sex ratio imbalance, right? Rural feminists all want to abort their female fetus. But however, with this one-child policy, a lot of families, they can only have one child, then you got a girl. So this single daughter, now, for the first time in Chinese history, that this large cohort of single daughter, they grew up. They were the center of their 6 adults, parents and the grandparents. All the resources also goes to this little princess, okay? So now you see a large number of young women now, because they received all these resources in education, very soon you saw large number of excellent, talented young women, okay? I give lectures in China, different places, all those presidents of different universities, they also say, yeah, nowadays, in whatever fields, not just humanities and social sciences, and also science, natural science, the top candidates of national entrance, college entrance exam, always female. And even in the universities, the top academic attainments, the students are also female. You can see just tons of these young women, when they got the resources, they can really develop into very capable, knowledgeable, talented young women. However, as soon as they enter the job market, they'll encounter tremendous gender discrimination and sexual harassment, all kinds of situations confronting them. And they didn't have any resources, neither the institutional resources nor the social resources, because they were just young. They just graduated from school. They had nothing, unlike my generation. My generation, when we were very early on, because that's in the socialist period, promoted gender equality by socialist state feminists. So we were already, like, after college, graduation from college, you already got very nice positions in the system. Like, in my situation, I graduated and then was retained to teach in college, okay, just as a bachelor degree holder. But for them, there's no positions, no nice position, no nice jobs in the system. And outside, they also, no social networks, no net resources, but they had tremendous frustrations. They want to voice their own demands. So they discovered one way to call the government attention and the public attention. That is to stage public performance, okay? Then take some pictures. And then, because we live in the internet age, then they upload the pictures. And then these pictures will go viral on the internet. Then these issues, this group, even though the activists were not in large number, however, they made a huge splash on the internet because of their images. All those very, very bold and daring images. Let's look at this one. This is to oppose domestic violence. So just 3 young women. Of the 3, 2, the 2 on the side later were detained in 2015, the Feminist Five. So that's to oppose domestic violence. And just 3 people then took picture and upload on the internet, okay? All right, let's see what else. Oh, comes the 5 sisters. That's the global mobilization, okay? That's the picture in front of UN. Let's see what else. More domestic violence, okay? Police were standing in front of them. Okay, hold on. Yeah, all right. So, hold on. Yeah. So let me try to move. So they did. I don't think I have time to go through each pictures. What I want to emphasize is that. So they raised a bunch of issues, anti-domestic violence. Eventually, the anti-domestic violence law was passed by the People's Congress after 20 years of struggle, of the maneuver, of the lobbying, of the protests by all these different generations of feminists. Then they did affected the legal, the legislation as well. I cannot get all the pictures. That's another big stunt they did. They all topless, okay, naked, and to attract public attention. It's also anti-domestic violence event. So suffice to say, let me just try to conclude here quickly. So from 2012 to 2015, these young feminists were able to use their very sensational, eye-catching performance in the public space. They're always doing that in the public space, okay? And using their own bodies. They have no other resources, okay? Their body becomes their tool to protest. So oftentimes they use their own body. And then the pictures were focused on that. This was all these issues they said demanding for the passage of laws of anti-domestic violence. You know, their demands are always paralleled in characters and put together with their images, very shocking images. So they raised the issues on anti-domestic violence. That law in the end passed. And they also tried to find a picture of occupying men's room. They also went to the public toilet places to occupy men's room, demanding for more toilets for women because, you know, women were, you go many places, you see that the women's restroom always line up, you know, and men in and out, no problems, and women just always line up very long line. So demanded equity in public space. And actually that public action also caught the government attention, different local governments, and even the central government in the end, I think in 2016 or 17, 2016, also passed the regulation that now everywhere in China, in all the public spaces, private government didn't care, public spaces, the ratio should be 1 to 1.5, okay? The toilets. In Shanghai, they're talking about it now. We are more advanced in Shanghai. Public space should be 1 to 2 or even 1 to 3, okay, to avoid this crisis of these women's using public bathroom. Somehow I cannot move forward to have more pictures. So let's see. However, this kind of activism, I want to show you some other things. Oh, sexual assault and sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is another thing. American Me Too, became very popular. So everybody always assumed that Chinese Me Too is following the American example. No, actually not. Actually, these young women started their own anti-sexual harassment protests way early. 2012, they already started. Let's see if I can find anything about the sexual harassment. Yeah, that's the famous one. That's 2012. 2012, a group of young feminists in Shanghai, they just staged in Shanghai subway station because in the public transportation, sexual harassment was horrible. So they staged there to protest and against the sexual harassment. And then later, all kinds of protests against sexual assault. And even this is a professor. There's a professor, Ai Xiaoming, and she also put on topless picture in support of her. And I'm not sure how many of you have heard of this event. This is Ye Haiyan. She and a group of feminists went to Hainan Island because an elementary school there, the principal of an elementary school, pimped 5th grade female students to local officials. Okay, because now all the Chinese officials, they want virgins. Now with sexual freedom, you get virgins lower and lower age, okay? So these principals are doing that. So feminists went down, her name is Ye Haiyan, that's a very famous sign. They just protest, said the principals, open the hotel room with me, let go of young students. That's on the sign was talking about. That one also go viral, but Ye Haiyan herself was arrested. The whole thing was made into a documentary film. If you're interested, you can try to access documentary film. Actually, I ordered that one. It's called Hooligan Sparrow. It's totally documented the whole process, their protests and how she was harassed and she was jailed, the whole process. So it's already very clear for everybody that up to 2015, their public performance was, the space for public performance was closed. They were not able to use that strategy to raise their demands, to call public awareness, to call the officials' attention. But still, their activity was still going on. Today, they're still going on. However, they have to use other means, not so visible. In other words, before they strategically try to catch people's eyes. In other words, visibility was what they pursued in their performance actions. But now you cannot, because when you attract the public attention, your visibility attract public attention, at the same time you also attracted unwanted attention from the police. So they cannot do that anymore. But just for that period of comparatively speaking, openness in the Chinese society between 2012 and 2015, they left us with all these very fascinating images of feminist performing art, in a sense, with a feminist intervention goal in their mind. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. University of Michigan welcomes back another alumna, Celine Wang, who did a dual degree here, both in art history and also in the Stamp School of Art and Design. And she's currently pursuing her master's in arts and modern and contemporary art history at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Celine's primary areas of interest include performance art with an emphasis on gender and sexuality, which I think is I'm really looking forward to the talk in light of Professor Zheng's talk, and also interest in modern and contemporary art in East Asia, and installation art, public art, and land art. So please welcome Celine.
Well, thank you for introducing me, and many thanks to Professor Zhang for inviting me over from Chicago. In my senior year in the University of Michigan, I took a class with her, and it was an upper-level art history class. It was my first time really systematically learn about contemporary Chinese art, and in that class, I learned about this artist Ma Liuming and also performance art in China. That was really inspiring, and so I wrote this paper. I'm gonna start my presentation now. The rise of individualism in contemporary Chinese art is a very big topic. I'm afraid that I'm unable to summarize every aspect in short 15-minute presentation. I would like to shed light on performance art, or more specifically, body art in the 1990s, as an entrance point to a very specific phase in history when discourses of gender and sexuality profoundly manifested in art. They rise closely associated with the concept of individualism. Along with my research on a variety of Chinese performance artists, I chose artist Ma Liuming as my primary case study. So in many respects, he was distinguished from his contemporaries for his vital role as the first male artist who critically engaged with gender issues. Departing from the golden age for Chinese body art, I hope I could offer some insightful readings on the rise of individualism in this talk. At the end of the 1980s, contemporary Chinese artists witnessed a historically significant turn beginning from the decline of the 85 Art Nouveau movement, regarded as the Chinese avant-garde movement. It successfully brought regional avant-garde groups into a unified front. Nevertheless, a growing tension towards the notion of collectivism in the society quickly turned into a bygone history in 1989, the year of Tiananmen Square protests and the China avant-garde exhibition. In the early 1990s, the rise of body art in Beijing demonstrated this rapid transformation from collectivism to individualism. In compiling and analyzing these radical performances from this time period, I was simply fascinated by how body art, as a distinct and unique domain of artist expression, became a site for political, social, and individual articulations in private as well as in public affairs. So Amelia Jones describes body art as one of the most dramatic, and to do so, if it's engaged with on the deepest level of its production, precisely because of its entailment of the subject, as it's embodied in all of its particularities of race, class, gender, sexuality, and so on. In many Western performance art theories, the exposure of body, the presence of nudity, becomes the most efficient way for self-expression. So in face of the body, viewers are able to engage in direct visual conversations with those performers. Such concept was adapted, it's regionalized in China, as the Chinese term for performance art, 行为艺术, indicates the behavioral aspect or conduct from meaningful action that is articulated in art. The human body is directly translated as lived body, incorporating the notion of body as life and body as substance, wherein this body illustrates a unified representation of both spiritual and physical self. So with these concepts in mind, I would like to discuss the time period from the 1990s to the early 2000s, where body art was featured as its golden age. In Chinese body art, the notion of gender identity as in essence a catalyst or a limit would allow its contemporary audience to re-evaluate the divergent performative acts by male and female artists. In the 1990s, the East Village became home to a group of young artists who just moved to Beijing. It was also seen as a home to body art, of the East Village artists Ma Liuming, Zhang Huan, and Zhu Ming were considered as the pioneers. Zhang Huan regarded physical endurance. I know it's been mentioned many times today, but still it's part of my presentation. Please bear with me. Sorry. Zhang Huan regarded physical endurance as a symbol of masculinity. His major works include Pilgrimage, Wind and Water in New York, Foam Series, Family Tree, Piece Number 2, and 12 Square Meters. In those works, the artist engaged in a series of self-imposed physical acts. So in 12 Square Meters, as mentioned, one of his earliest performances enacted in the East Village, Zhang Huan sat naked inside a foul-smelling public washroom, covered in the liquid mixture of honey and sticking fish sauce. His body started to attract flies and bugs. He remained motionless for an entire hour to demonstrate his physical endurance and individual will. So here we see Zhu Ming immersing himself inside a transparent balloon. Also back in 1994, he staged physical demanding performances that were demonstrative of the extreme rawness and wildness associated with the notion of masculinity. While different forms of body performances continued to develop in the 90s, male artists assumed dominant role in the field. They were recognized and at the same time questioned by their fellow female artists. It was not until 1994 that Xu Hong published a short essay entitled Way Out Abyss by Feminist Criticism, later regarded as a manifesto of Chinese feminist art. In the following year, the feminist curator and critic Liao Wen held one of the most important female artist exhibitions in Beijing Art Museum. Entitled Women's Approach in Contemporary Chinese Art, this exhibition invited 12 female artists to participate, including the later internationally well-known female artist Lin Tianmiao. This venue encouraged the later generations, such as He Chenyao, Duan Yingmei, and Ma Qiusha, to become aware of their individual values as women. Their works interweave identity politics and gender inequality in Chinese society. So in the middle of the slide is an archival photo of He Chenyao's performance, Opening the Great Wall. So in 2001, after her visit to the German artist Etche Schutz's exhibition of recycled consumer waste installations on the Great Wall, she decided spontaneously to enact her own performance by taking her clothes off and walking through the installations. Among those performers, no one really challenged the nature of gender. So it was Ma Liuming who elevated the status of gender identity to a reconfiguration of what makes a man and a woman a woman. In his serial performance from 1993 to 2001, Feng Ma Liuming, he created Feng, a fictional character with a feminine face, a slender body, and a male autonomy who usually appear naked in those enactments. Ma Liuming did more than just simply staging the gender. He profoundly challenged its performativity as a regulatory norm and further claimed that gender was not an actual fact, instead a becoming. So among all of those performances from the series of Feng Ma Liuming, I specifically picked the two performances he enacted in 1994, Feng Ma Liuming's Lounge No. 1 and 2, for their historical association with the vanishing of the East Village. From here, I would like to suggest a new perspective. Beneath the illusion of gender ambiguity, the notion of self-controlling gender identity and the concept of individualism are central to his performances. In both performances, he invited a group of his artist friends to witness him standing naked in the yard while steaming food in a pot. In the Feng Ma Liuming's Lounge No. 1, after he steamed a live fish in the pot, he placed the cooked fish on a glass table and then sat next to the fish, holding a long plastic tube with one side connected to his mouth and the other to his penis. He sucked and breathed through the tube as an act of recycling within his inner body. After sharing the fish meat with the audience, Ma Liuming threw the remains in the fish tank. For the second performance, he invited a larger group of audience to join him. In this archival photo on the right, taken by the East Village photographer Rong Rong, Ma Liuming stood behind a cooking bench, holding a pair of long chopsticks in his right hand and the lid of the pan in his left. His beautiful black hair naturally fell to shoulder length, slightly covering the right side of his face as he tilted his head downward. The artist promoted a visual confusion between his face and body, with due emphasis on his shaped eyebrows and red lips as he offered himself a feminine face. But when looking down, one saw his unshaven pubic hair and the inevitable presence of his male genitals. The rich persona of Feng stemmed from Ma Liuming's own experience of having been bothered for his girly appearance since a young age. He attempted to integrate his Feng Ma Liuming performances with the concept of mid-sex, 中性, which refers to a status set in between men and women and the capacity to embrace both masculine and feminine into a single being. He writes, "The concept of mid-sex aims to reveal this kind of awkward stance. People's judgment of others are based on clothing and other so-called cultural attributes, and not on the actual person. The manner in which material objects are treated often indicates the manner in which we treat the spirit." In 1999, in his response to the interviewer and fellow artist Chen Zhijian, Ma Liuming articulated that gender ambiguity was the main theme of his work. But beyond that focus, he was explicitly interested in the point that the indistinguishableness of gender comes from his belief that no clear border may be drawn between men and women. Indeed, more critics claim Feng's nature of gender ambiguity, wherein the ambiguity came twofold, namely the difficulty to classify Feng into the binary gender system and its nature of offering open interpretations. Now, the suggestion that Feng's gender is ambiguous requires a bit of further understanding. So at this point of my paper, I paused my research on artists and wondered what kind of method would be appropriate to apply. So I looked up to Judas Butler theorist as she writes, "Gender is not exactly what one is, nor is it precisely what one has. Gender is the apparatus by which the production and normalization of masculine and feminine take place, along with the interstitial forms of hormonal, chromosomal, psychic, and performative that gender assumes. In Judas Butler's theory of gender performativity, persons are regulated by gender, wherein this regulation operates as a condition of cultural intelligibility for any person. Gender holds an internal discontinuity that sometimes fails to repeat the binary gendered acts, thereby revealing the groundlessness of the identity's ground. Indeed, there is no pre-existing identity against its acts but can be measured or judged. As Butler states, gender can be neither true nor false, neither real nor apparent, neither original nor derived. As credible bearers of those attributes, however, gender can be rendered thoroughly and radically incredible." So this action of rendering was fully articulated in Ma Liuming's intention to generate a quandary to categorize Feng within the binary gender system. Man can be seen as masculine, but that does not make him a male. Hence, the artist strived to achieve gender in its actual nature of doing. He successfully subverted the social restrictions on gender and redeveloped its nature of performative fluidity. That being said, Feng's gender was designed to be destabilized. All considered, Feng's gender was designed to be unstable, uncategorized, and self-controlled. If gender performativity was suggested in Feng, then where were the signs? And further, why could they not be identified in the first place, where most critics seem only to perceive Feng as gender ambiguity and interpret nothing beyond that inference? Given the fact that Ma Liuming was placed under arrest for 2 months and accused of doing the porn show in 1994, what does his imprisonment signify? Ma Liuming subverted existing social conventions of gender to stage his control of his own body and private life. His 2 performances in 1994 are conditioned by a number of external circumstances. The Chinese government was sensitive to issues that might be threaten the progress of modernization and social stability. These works therefore serve as a form of escape from gender and sexual restriction. Seen from this perspective, Ma Liuming's imprisonment in 1994 highlights the boundaries of an idealized healthy society, a concept put forward by the ruling authorities. In tracing the history of body art in the 1990s, we also observe growing attempts to publicly address issues of gender and sexuality through a variety of media. In 1992, Li Yinghe and Wang Xiaobo published their work looking into the male homosexual community in China as the first sociological Chinese book on the research of male homosexuals in the post-Mao period. In 1996, the first gay life feature film, East Palace, West Palace, directed by Zhang Yuan, was released in mainland China. So at this end of my presentation, I would like to share with you some lingering questions arise from my research. To what extent could the notion of individualism be expressed through performance art? Why did performance art, especially from 1980s to 2000s, have such capacity to threaten the socialist morality and potentially also socio-political stability in Chinese society? And finally, to what extent can individuals' freedom and autonomy be practiced and expressed without violating laws in contemporary Chinese art? Thank you.
I'm not touching. Markus Nornes, professor of film, television, and media, professor of Asian languages and cultures, and also art and design. Markus Nornes is a scholar of Asian cinema and a documentary filmmaker. He specializes in Japanese studies and also Chinese studies, and documentary and translation theory. He arrived at the University of Michigan in '96, and much of his work has explored the history of Japanese documentary and its theoretical implications, as well as nonfiction production in other parts of Asia. Markus has also published widely on the topic of screen translation, and I hope we learn a little bit about that. Thank you so much, Markus. Welcome.
So I just want to start by thanking Zheng Feng for organizing this. It's been really fascinating. And welcome to everybody from out of town. Welcome to our museum. It's a wonderful place. As Tina said, this is a real interface between students, faculty, and the town. And that was pretty obvious today. I don't know if you walked around, but like when we came in the morning, there was a pedagogy workshop for K through 12 going on up there. And then during lunch and then our break, in the main atrium, they were doing stand-up. And I noticed in the lobby, or in the audience, there were a lot of stoners giggling, because I don't know if you realize it, but today is Hash Bash. I noticed it's not on Zhang Feng's schedule. For those of you who don't know, Hash Bash is a local tradition. It's on the first Saturday of every April. And it started in 1972 as a legalization rally, when John Sinclair, the political activist, got busted for possession. And this went all the way up to the Supreme Court. In any case, they've been going on strong every year. And this year, because, of course, last year it became legal, they took their sign from last year, I noticed, and it said, "Legalize 2018." And this time they used the same old banner, and they put a D at the end of legalize. And the crowd was, I'd say, a good 5,000 people more than usual. And the fragrance was stronger than usual, I noticed as well. I did not partake, because I knew I was going to be standing here. We can all go over afterwards, maybe. Anyways, what I thought I'd do, actually, is tell you a little bit about the Chinese film scene such as it is here at U of M, and then a little bit about my own research. So I don't know when film started really being shown here, like a Chinese film as a series. My sense is that it was after I came. I came here, as you heard, in 1996, and I was hired under the title Professor of Asian Cinema. This was the first position with that title in North America. There were positions like that in Japan, I know, but outside of Japan, it might be the first in the world. Because, of course, while this is a very venerable place for Asian studies, it was not, popular culture was probably beyond the pale. I mean, I came with more books on Asian film than the library had in Japanese. So that says a lot, and I began teaching in ALC and in the film department. ALC, Asian Languages and Cultures, where I was offering the first classes on popular art, and it was a huge step for them. And now it's like very, very typical. Every university, good university, has positions for Asian cinema. But Melissa was talking about the issue of birth and periodization. Maybe it's hard to do that for the fine arts, contemporary fine arts, but in film it was pretty clear that Yellow Earth kicked something off in the feature film, and then in documentary, Bumming in Beijing kicked off the documentary scene in independent scene in China. And I paid a lot of attention to that. In fact, I was in Japan in the 90s as a programmer, as a curator for a film festival, a documentary film festival called Yamagata. And I remember Wu Wangguang coming into the office, and I was like the only person who could speak English, so we struggled to talk. And Yamagata was kind of a clearinghouse for independent filmmakers from China. They would always come through. So I met all these people all the time at the festivals, would watch the films. And then the Center for Chinese Studies here started a film series that was all documentaries from China. I think partly because Lydia Liu was here and was really interested in it at the time. But I kept an eye on it, but I really didn't do much research, and I didn't write at all about it, actually. I was writing about Taiwanese cinema, which I loved dearly, and Hong Kong a little bit, and my main thing is Japan. However, in 2008, I was invited to be a juror on the documentary film festival in Songzhuang, run by Li Xiangting, and I was just blown away. I mean, I'd been watching the films, and they'd gotten better and better with the arrival of digital. But what really impressed me was just the scene. I finally visited Wu Wangguang in Zhaojiangdi. I then hung out most of the time in Songzhuang. And I don't know if you've ever seen their catalogs, but at least, especially back around that time in the late 2000s, they had pages in the back that listed all these great fine artists, like Fang Lijun and who else? Yue Minjun, people like that, who had probably just been shaken down by Li Xiangting to subvent this great film festival. And so and then at the very same time, there was a big gallery in 798 with a Spanish name, Iberia, had started an archive of documentary. So it was just this incredibly lively scene, and there was absolutely no way to make money on it, and yet it was being subvented by the fine arts and the market. And I was utterly fascinated by Li Xiangting, who had kind of abandoned the fine arts, at least as far as everyone was telling me, for documentary, and created this big film fund to support it, create a school and an archive and things like, and a film festival, because you couldn't sell this stuff. There was a kind of purity to it for him, and a new history that was being written through this media, and a new forms of self-expression, which was also his main thing. And I loved that. So I went away from that, and I studied up a little bit more on the reception context. And so I don't read Chinese, but I had a really good network in that world, and so I wrote an essay that's often taught on the film festival scene in China, and that was in 2009. And then I just did an update on it. If you're interested, they're both in Film Quarterly. The current issue of Film Quarterly has another update on the film festival scene in China now that most of the interesting ones have been shut down. And then a lot of new interesting ones have popped up. And in any case, while this was going on, there were some really interesting things happening here. We did our film series every year, and then we'd have, I like programming, and curation. I've always worked on film festivals since the 80s. So I've always done some events once in a while for Chinese film, because I'm also doing Japan and Korea as well. We had visitors like Wu Guang and let's see, is it? I think Ai Xiaoming came here, right? At least the center actually produced a DVD of one of her films. And Jian Liu, the animator, came here for an event. I did two slightly bigger events. One was when Yunfest was one of the main independent film festivals in China. It took place in Kunming, and it was run by an anthropology institute. And basically, they were exploiting this anthropology institute to do just fantastic programming of independent films from China, and with a deep engagement to Vietnam and Burma and other places around there. Yunfest started having troubles until it was finally just shut down right before it was going to be shown. And so since they couldn't show the films there, I just rounded up some money here. Impressively, some of it was from the Confucius Institute. And I showed the films that couldn't be shown at Yunfest. And I invited Mao Chengyu and Cao Feng, two of the best filmmakers, independent filmmakers at that time. Another thing I did was just a couple years ago now on Exile, and trying to interrogate that term and think about the phenomenon that's going on right now, where you have all these independent filmmakers who are moving out, whether to Hong Kong or Europe or here, and leading double lives, one foot in, 1 foot out. So Exile was in quotes, and we brought 3 filmmakers, Cui Ziyan and Wang Wo and Ying Liang, and had a big, interesting discussion about what their lives are like now and what's going on in the scene with this current illiberalism in the film culture. So that's kind of what's been going on here. There's always something. And then we have the Ann Arbor Film Festival, which is in its 57th year, always shows interesting Chinese work. Zhang Fang just did a great program of women filmmakers there. It was just last week. And now I guess I'll turn to just a current project, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. And this is connected to it. This is not just China, but it's also Korea and Japan and Hong Kong and Taiwan. And so it's a regional project, and it's on calligraphy in East Asian film. And the title of the book is going to be Brushed in Light. This was something I actually thought of almost 30 years ago when I was in grad school. And I toyed around using this as a dissertation topic. But I talked to a bunch of people, like really famous art historians who will go unnamed. And they were like the top art historians for China and Japan. And I was sort of bouncing this topic off of them. And every one of them looked me square in the eye and said, "There's no calligraphy in film." And that was just like the end of the conversation. They wouldn't even talk about it or consider it. And I thought, but yeah, there totally is, and this could be cool. And I started doing research for it and immediately got completely freaked out over 2,000 years of art historical debates and philosophy in 3 languages. So I stopped and did something else. But about 10 years ago now, I was at Harvard for a year, and so I was hanging out with philosophers like Stanley Cavell and David Roderick, and I revisited their work, and I found a hook for starting this, taking this project off a back burner, which I'll tell you what the hook is at the end of this. But this was sort of stewing, keeping the pot stewed. When I was a grad student mulling this topic over, I wrote a paper on a very trashy period TV series in Japan called Hes Such, or this is the title for it. You translate that, it means people whose work is necessary murder. And this visitor came from Japan and was so charmed by that. She said, I couldn't believe you could write a paper on such a TV program in a graduate school. She had a good laugh over it. And then she revealed that she had been studying calligraphy for years with the guy who did the title. It's a very famous title in Japan. Everybody knows this calligraphy. And he's one of the top modern calligraphers in Japan. He just died last year. And when I got married, that woman remembered this. She couldn't forget it. And she told her sensei. And so she went to him and asked him to write it for us as a wedding present. And, well, because it was a wedding present, they took off the first 2 characters, necessary murder, and just left people who work, which was like totally appropriate. And that was in my living room for 20 years, reminding me like every day that I had this thing to get to. And I finally got to it, and the first thing I did was get some money for undergraduate assistants. We have a great program here where undergraduates will help you with your research. It's in every field in the university. And I had these undergrads come to our video collection. My department has a library for video, just a teaching library. We have about 30,000 DVDs in one room. And I put one student at A and the other one at Z, and they went through every drawer, pulled out every East Asian film, scanned through it, and they made frame grabs of any calligraphy they found. And I've ended up with a corpus of 3,000 images. It's the first time I'd ever worked off of a corpus. It was fascinating because just like the ideas kept percolating up, and every week I met these undergraduates and we'd debate what they found and talk about it. And there are images like this, of course, which is, this is one of the reasons, maybe the reason that the art historian said there's no calligraphy in cinema. But there are interesting things like this too. This is clearly a calligrapher who knew he was doing and was playing around with different eras of calligraphy to make a kind of statement about humanity. It's The Human Promise is the English title of the film. And I learned gradually that there are a lot of very famous people and calligraphers were doing calligraphy. This is a very famous film from Japan called Face of Another by Teshigawara Hiroshi. Well, his father was the founder of the Sogetsu school of Ikebana, Sofu. And Sofu did the calligraphy for this and many films from the 1960s and 70s in Japan. And you can see it's a sort of avant-garde riff on Lee-style calligraphy. And there were certain filmmakers, notably King Hu, Im Kwon-taek, and Kurosawa Akira, who really paid a lot of attention to the calligraphy for their titles, but also for props. And so Kurosawa, when he got enough power in the industry, around the time he made Throne of Blood, every one of his titles is by one of the most famous artists in Japan. In Taiwan, this is Dong Yansi, the top calligrapher in Taiwan, and she does most of Tsai Ming-liang's films and many others. Most of her work, if you know her, is on really, really large canvases. And so it's perfect for the cinema as well. Im Kwon-taek. And then famous people making films. This is a Mishima Yukio film, avant-garde film called Patriotism, where he basically does a dry run of his suicide. He did this and was thinking really carefully, I think, about the very top character, which is kind of unstable itself. Very careful. And he also did the scroll in the background of his set. That's him acting before it. And then I also I couldn't help noticing that calligraphy is absolutely ubiquitous in film culture outside of the films. This is the entrance to one of the theaters at Li Xiangting's Film Fund in Songzhuang. And he did the calligraphy around the outside. There's another really wonderful story about this poster, actually, because when the 1989 art exhibition was shut down because of the gun incident, the artist, since he had been organizing this, he drew in calligraphy on a piece of plywood the announcement that the exhibition was shut down. And this was long gone, but when one of his film festivals was shut down, the filmmakers went to him and asked him to write the white notice there in the middle to announce that the film festival was cut down, echoing the 1989 incident. And then, rambunctious as they are, the following year, the poster, which is designed by filmmaker Wang Qingsong, used the picture of the announcement that they had been shut down. And then the catalog that year for their film festival actually had a photograph of the 1989 board, which an artist had found in his house because he had taken the board and put it in a hole over in his roof. So it had been sitting there since 1989. So this kind of thing, you just can't imagine in Western film culture. The Roman letter and typesetting just doesn't have the same kind of complexity. Here's Li Xiangting again. I put these together because his name kept coming up. The filmmaker is Zhao Liang, who's also a still photographer and great filmmaker, and that's the title calligraphy for his film Petition. And it was drawn by Li Xiangting, who he went to and asked to write the title for him. And then he framed it, or he mounted it. And then there's all sorts of weirdness. A lot of writing on the body and things like that. So my book is basically done. I'm now preparing it. I'll finish it this summer. It's going to have, I got a grant from a few different places, national organizations, to put my 3,000 image corpus online in a database. So we're preparing the database, and this will be completely open and linked to the ebook. So like when I talk about painting calligraphy on skin, there will be a link from Skin that will send you to the database and bring up all the images where that appears. things like that. And then the book basically has a structure like starting from pretty simple stuff, how calligraphy in film is and is not calligraphy. So I define terms at the beginning. And then I go through a whole sequence that goes into semiotics, how Chinese characters work, how Korean characters work, their differences, and how they make meaning. Also, the issue of autonomism, all the autonomisms that happen in calligraphy, from the way ink leaches into paper to the different kinds of accidents in the act of writing that get recorded. That combined with cinema. And then I move into narrative and how there's many, many films that work the act of writing into their stories, sometimes in very, very clever ways. And also, mistaken characters, or at a very simple level, you show a room that has a row of brushes, and this is a scholar, right? At a more complex level, it's something like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Michelle Yeoh comes in and sees Zhang Yi practicing calligraphy, and she says, "I'll write your name," and she does it. And one character in her name, because it's cursive, looks like sword, and that's the moment where she knows this is the woman who stole the sword, right? You can't do this in Western cinema, but it's quite ubiquitous in East Asia. Then I work through issues of aesthetic force in calligraphy, because I noticed that each film culture uses calligraphy quite differently, and has something often to do with the power of that image when it's on a set. In Japan, if you notice in Japanese films, whenever there's calligraphy, the calligraphy will be set on the extreme edge. It sets the whole thing out of balance. In Korea, especially in the period films, they'll have wall screens behind the characters. It's just a paperscape of calligraphy behind the characters. Often comes up. And in the studios, I went to all of the studios in Asia and messed around the props departments. And in the Korean film studios, it's just row upon row upon row of those screens. And in China, more often than not, if you have calligraphy showing up on screen, the composition of the frame snaps to symmetry. Symmetry is really unusual in world cinema. And if you look in any book, including in Chinese film books, how-to books or cinematography books in China, symmetry is usually associated with monumentality, fascism, and things like power. But actually in Chinese film, if you notice, if there's calligraphy or couplets, everything will suddenly be symmetrical, and not in monumental ways at all, in very matter-of-fact, everyday ways. So I have a whole thing about that. And then this leads finally to the conclusion, which was inspired by Cavell, especially. And that's basically that these are two art forms that are, in a very fundamental way, representations of historical, actual human bodies moving in time and space. But a time and space from the past that's been displaced and represented to you, a viewer. That's true, I think, of calligraphy, and it's true of film. In calligraphy, I was just at a massive exhibition of, I'm going to forget his name again, Wang Qingsong, I don't know Chinese, classical calligrapher in Tokyo. And I just loved watching the people looking at the calligraphy. Their bodies would be going like this. some of them would be going like this. People's bodies move because there's something going on between them and the very moment of inscription with the moving body and all of the autonomisms involved in calligraphy. And in cinema, you have the moving bodies of actors who's also displaced in time and space, presented to you in this way that looks so real and present. So it seems to me that cinema extends the life of and possibilities of calligraphy and vice versa. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Markus. Our next speaker, Robert Adanto, is a classically trained actor and documentary filmmaker. He earned an MFA in acting from New York University's graduate acting program. As a filmmaker, Robert is interested in exploring how artists respond to rapid and sometimes or oftentimes catastrophic transformation. His documentaries have looked at China's march towards the future, and the work that he's produced has been screened at over 40 international film festivals around the world. He's a longtime collaborator with both Fong and Qingsong. Please welcome from West Palm Beach, Robert Adanto.
Good afternoon. Before I begin, I want to thank Fong for inviting me to. This has been amazing. Some of the people here I know, some of them I know their work, both written, curatorially, and it's been an amazing experience over the last less than 48 hours. I just wanted to thank you for that. And again, it was great to see Wang Qingsong's work. You'll see a little bit here one more time maybe. I want to thank Robert Adams, and I'm happy because this is the third time I've actually done something more than any other U.S. university. This is the third time I've done something at the University of Michigan. I didn't go here. I went to NYU and I went to Arizona State for undergrad. But in 2010, I screened a film about Iranian female artists that has Shirin Neshat, and I want to thank this gentleman for connecting me to Shirin Neshat. Do you remember that? We were in Hong Kong. I was eating breakfast. I was going to screen The Rising Tide at the Hong Kong Art Fair before it became Basel. And he said, "Robert, what's your next film about?" And I had just seen a gallery that had a bunch of amazing work by Iranian female artists. And I said, "Richard, I think I'm going to make a film about Iranian female artists." He's like, "That's a good topic. You know, I know Shirin Neshat. I can connect you. I'd love The Rising Tide, and I'm sure she'd want to be in your project." And because of him, I got everybody on board because Shirin Neshat had decided to be in my film. So thank you, because both The Rising Tide and Pearls on the Ocean Floor kind of put me on the map in terms of making documentaries about contemporary art. We're going to talk a little bit about The Rising Tide, but I do want to say I made Pearls on the Ocean Floor. And I am very interested in exploring how artists respond to rapid, catastrophic change, societal, or as in City of Memory, which looked at New Orleans artists who lived through Hurricane Katrina. It could be a natural disaster. My previous film is about radical fourth wave feminist performance in Brooklyn. You brought me here to screen that. Robert, you also played a role in that. I got to screen that in 2016. That's a film with Narcissister, Anne Hirsch, Leah Schrager, Kate Durbin. And I've been screening that one for a long time. And my latest film is about a Belgrade-based performance artist named Marta Jovanovic, who in the course of 2 years that I filmed her, left a violent, abusive relationship and did all these really amazing performances in response to that abuse and using art to transcend, which is really the theme of all my films. In terms of The Rising Tide, let me ask you this. Who knows this artist? This isn't the artist, this is the subject, but anybody know this work? I purposely chose this during the break because we'd been seeing the same artists over and over. Christopher Phillips, whose is this? It's Peng and Cheng. You guys know them? From Shanghai? They did that whole magazine for colors. Bunch of amazing images like this woman here. I don't know who she is, but I just like that image. They did a whole thing about the new China, and they documented like little girls at swimming pools, weightlifters, bad guys, punk rockers, just great photos all vibrant, and I just like the way they look. And actually, they reached out to me. I had just left China in 2006 when I started making The Rising Tide, as did a lot of artists under the age of, say, 40. Wang Qingsong is the oldest artist represented in The Rising Tide, but everybody else was born like 78 to like 82 or so. And they differ greatly. They came of age after the Cultural Revolution. They might have been living while the Cultural Revolution was towards its end, but they came of age afterwards, which is important for a couple of reasons, and I don't think anybody talked about this so much, but it was the reason why I got involved in making a film about Chinese contemporary art. Back in 2004, I digress for a little bit, I was helping a friend of mine make a documentary as a researcher. She was completing a film about Cuba, and I went with her the last time. I had done such a great job finding archival photos and videos going through an archive in DC that she took me along to do some follow-up interviews. Anyways, I knew then when I experienced that, helping her out, that I wanted to make my own documentary, but I was like, okay, what am I gonna do? So I'm going through a bunch, like a Borders bookstore, and I'm noticing that I'm seeing all these books by people like Jonathan Spence, all these different thinkers telling us about China. This is 2005, there's 3 years before the Olympics, and Megan always said, she became a mentor, she's the filmmaker who made the film about China, that you're gonna probably need about 3 years. And think about this, Robert, you're independent, no one's financing this film yet. Think about this, find a subject that you could start working on that no one else has made a film. And I still didn't know anything really that I was gonna do about Chinese contemporary art, but I was always interested in China, and I started reading all these books, and I raised some money, and I went and I did all these interviews in New York City and in DC with different people from think tanks. And so, for example, I interviewed Stephen Roach, who at the time was the guy, big economist, chief economist for, Morgan Stanley in Asia. And this is his latest book, and he's talking about the imbalance. He's very critical of Trump's treatment of China economically. Back then, Trump was nothing in terms of a leader. Is he now? We know. Anyways, but he was very critical of the trade imbalance, and he said, you know what? The United States, like 20 years from now, they're going to be hurting because of, and he was constantly arguing that we needed to, because China was buying all our debt, that there was too much of an imbalance and it was going to hurt us in the long run. Great interview. He didn't make it into The Rising Tide, but it was great for research. Again, at this point, I wasn't researching Chinese contemporary art. Do I just hit these arrows? Yeah. Then I interviewed Elizabeth Economy, who's got an amazing new book on Xi Jinping and his power grab in China. The new book is called Xi Jinping and the New Chinese State. I recommend it. I just started it. But back then I had read The River Runs Black, which is an amazing study of China's environmental damage, okay? Another good book. And Gordon Chang, who did make it into The Rising Tide, he wrote a book back then called The Coming Collapse of China. You may have seen him on the news. He's written a book about North Korea, and they've been bringing him back into the news cycle. Anyways, I did more interviews than this, and I got to talk to Jonathan Spence at one point. A former student of mine was at Yale, and I got to see him lecture, and I got to talk to him for a second, and I told him what I was thinking about doing, and I asked him, I said, so what do you think? He's like, that China had yet to really deal with its historical past, its recent historical past, and he says, it's growing, we've seen the greatest economic change, no greater change has come to any individual country, not during the British, when the British industrialized, not in the American rise. Nobody has had the growth that China has had over the last 30 years. This is incredible. It's an incredible transformation. He goes, you got to get to China and see what's going on there. But will they become a great power, a great nation? I'm not so sure. They'll become a great people. They're great people, but their system is stopping them from really seeing what's holding them back. And that's why it was great to hear from you. I'd love to talk to you later. Thank you. Anyways, then I picked up this book. I never got to meet this gentleman, but this is an amazing book. Anybody ever read this? It was the book for the Financial Times. He's actually a Financial Times reader, but a bunch of people chose it as the best book of 2006 looking at China. And I start the film with this quote because I love this. He says, sometimes the biggest events are telegraphed by the merest of harbingers. And I had been like really into this idea of like China's transformation, but also how the United States would navigate this rise of a new superpower. And I still hadn't really thought about doing anything about Chinese art. I thought for a while about possibly looking at Chinese writers, but never thought that that would translate to film. I have an MFA in acting, and I'm really into film, cinema, and active stuff. And I had this great teacher, Ron Van Loo, who said, even if you end up doing a Talking Heads documentary, which largely The Rising Tide is, it's great to see people working through thoughts live. I'll give you that. If you can capture them thinking through. And so I started researching, and I found somebody like Birdhead, right? The amazing visuals. I just saw this stuff, and I was like, wow. And then I read interviews with them, and they said, here's why we use cameras, not because we're poor. Not because we're poor. We're middle class. We've grown up in Shanghai. But and they were all trained in drawing and painting, but they said we use photos and video because our world is changing so rapidly, and it's only through those mediums that we can capture and document what's being destroyed. And I knew then, I reached out to them, and I was able to connect to them actually on MySpace, and they said they'd be in the film. This is another photo of them. They're constantly going around Shanghai, but there's this series like 2003 to 2006. They shoot each other, they shoot themselves, time lapse. Then there was Yang Yong. And I started to formulate ideas, and I knew I was going to go to China based on themes, reading about the new urbanization, right? I knew about artists responding to the growth, a new generation of young people whose parents became middle class, and they were able to have digital cameras. They were living in those coastal cities of Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen, and that's where I went in 2006. I saw Yang Yong in Shenzhen. I love this series. I think we've seen a couple of these. And I loved it because it also reinforced some of the ideas regarding the great migration that was taking place in China, where millions of people were leaving the inner part of China to go to the coast, to go to Shenzhen, to work long hours, but to make, I think I remember reading, if they stayed in the interior, they made about the equivalent to $400 a year as opposed to $1,200. And that was like, for them, everything. And it was just so mind-boggling to wrap your head around what that meant. Like, okay, I'm gonna make $400, but here I'll make $1,200, but how much greater your life will be, even if it is in a factory in Shenzhen where you're working really hard. But these young ladies that he often photographed would have time off to have like a night, like a Westerner, in a club, dancing, wearing clothes, and having this life. And I was like, that's incredible. I just was blown away by that element, which I read about and read through his interviews. Then Chen Chulin, who I didn't interview in China. I saw her in Brooklyn when she was doing a residency right around 2007. And I love her work. And again, her story of the Three Gorges Dam displacing her family and learning about the progress, what was necessary for the Chinese as the growth continued to do these things in order to keep, the 1 point at the time, 3 billion people chasing the Chinese dream. The economy had to keep growing. Remember that? Like in 2005, their growth was like at 6.5, 7.5. They got to keep it going. I got caught up in that, like just tracing that and seeing elements that could be reinforced via the art. So Gordon Chang talks about these things through the film, and then I show stuff like imagery like that. Look at that. Who said the work still holds up? Somebody said that last night in a conversation. I think it does. I mean, look at that. How about that? Bam. Xiao Fei, interviewed her before she moved to Beijing. Met her at Vitamin and got to interview her. I love this. She was just finishing this. This piece is unbelievable. You guys have all seen this video? Yes, or a lot of you have, yeah. One of my all-time favorites. That finishes the film, showing that. Zheng climbing Mount Everest and cutting the tip off. That starts the film. His act of like saying we're gonna cut the tip off. Speaking about individuality, you know, he cut it just to his height. I love that metaphor. And I show the very end when they get to the top. Another work by him. Who else is focused on in the film? Our man. Is this the work we were talking about? Yes, I put it in there yesterday. All right, Wang Qingsong. You had this earlier. I love the emblazoned McDonald's. It was that one and the Christ with the butterfly cell phones flying were the ones. Those were the two images I first saw where I said, I've got to make a film about Chinese contemporary art, because I could just see the paradoxes, the contradictions of a country that had embraced capitalism, something foreign to their thinking, but you know, you've got a seated Buddha basically. And I loved the work and knew that. And he was actually the first artist I contacted who agreed to be in the film. And this, amazing. Look at that. I mean, you're right. Like, this was the time of audacious confidence. That's what I call it. Like, just like everybody making their work because the world was watching them and they knew it. As they got closer to the Beijing Olympics, like, that was the thing. I think all these artists knew that China's important right now and they're looking. So let's show them what we have. And I think that you guys saw the Beijing opening thing. Like, that was another manifestation of that confidence. Like, here we are on the stage. What do you think? Like, I don't know. You got Richard's quote right there about the rising tide. You ever see that, Richard? No, you never saw that. Richard wrote that. So I love this, flooding. I use that as the cover for the film. And I've been, blessed, honestly. I'm here, but also I got to screen with Christopher's exhibition, Shanghai Kaleidoscope in Toronto. I've screened at the Worcester Art Museum. I screened with Ma Zhang when it was at your museum, and all over, actually, twice in Australia, Goma, because of the artists I selected, and I caught the wave. I was in the right place at the right time in that era that we're talking about. I shot it in 2006, finished it in 2008, but a lot of the works, and then there were artists who I interviewed, like Liu Zheng, who didn't make it into the film, but I got to interview him, and I ended up interviewing 17 different artists when I was in China. I just had to kind of focus it, and I decided to go with film or video and photography and kind of show that generation too. All right? And then, anybody know who this is? Zheng. She lives in Brooklyn. And this was something she did right before the games, actually. It's on, have you guys seen this one? No? It's all good in the hood. She collected these t-shirts that are sold throughout Beijing of like slogans. And it's a whole series that she did. And I love this one. Anyways, she also did this series. What she did here, this is called Horizon. These are all girls that were orphaned or would have been orphaned with the One China policy. She often investigated that. But, and this is the crazy thing, and this is how I'm going to transition into the work I'm working on right now. In the film, she says that her parents, they both had been English professors, and they taught people English. They spoke English. Had been sent to the countryside to be pineapple farmers. And they experienced dislocation because there were ethnic minorities there that spoke a different language. They were often rejected by the population that was there because they were like, you're Han Chinese, what are you doing here, kind of thing. But they had to go there for a number of years. So she went to this place in the interior, I think it's near like how do you say this? Shangxi, like Shannxi. Is that right? Shanxi. Thank you. Anyway, so she went there, and this is where she shot this series. Now, anybody know this date? December 22nd, 1968. We know that the Cultural Revolution is already 2 years in, but I'll ask our illustrious sinologists in the audience to tell me what happened on that day in Chinese history. For 5 seconds, let's go. Nobody knows. Come on, guys. No, I don't blame you, because most people don't know, and I'm blessed again, and I'm going to make, I have a topic right now that I swear to God, I can win an Academy Award for documentary. I'm not lying. The topic is there, only I can screw it up. I've never felt like that. I've never felt like that before. I'm being very brazen. I'm like a Chinese person in 2006. No, I'm just kidding. Here we go. No, in that year, Mao starts, here we go, the Up to the Mountain, Down to the Countryside movement, also known as the Rustication Project or Sent Down Youth Movement. What happened there? Robert, raise your hand. 17 million Chinese youth, middle school age, and educated high school graduates were forced in basically a forced deportation into the countryside that often lasted 10 years. They worked hard. They labored hard. There were several suicides. Girls were raped. It happened, and it didn't end with Mao's death. It ended in 1980. So even though you have that radical affirmation in 1979 of art in the city, this program is still going on. Nobody knows this history. Check it out. And I have the source. He died this year. Yufan Wang gave me all the stories. He did interviews, and then he translated it. Penguin is going to publish this. I have the rights. He wrote all of these stories on Sent Down Youth, right? This was the Up to the Mountain, Down to the Countryside. This was a lot of the political propaganda. They sold it like beer. This was to stop the Red Guard chaos. He sent a lot of the Red Guard out. I have these stories where kids stole Catcher in the Rye. They stole all these books and they took them to the countryside. They were educating themselves with Western Lit. They had translated it into Chinese, right? All of this is going on, right? These are the kids that went, right? They worked. The shortest period was 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, right? Anybody see any familiar face there?
Number 2.
Who is it? President Xi. President Xi was a sent down youth. And I'm telling the story on 2 parallel tracks. This is going to rock. Watch. Xi Jinping, sent down youth. But he's written a book that everybody in China, this is where he slept as a sent down youth. He's selling it. There's little animated films in China selling this to youth because for Xi Jinping, this experience made him a great leader. It taught him, it gave him the strength to be the great leader of China today. All right? There's his book. He's written it, and everyone is being asked to read and to study this story. So I'm going to be telling parallel story with Michel Bonin. Anybody know him? He's the expert on the Rustification movement. He knew people, he's a French intellectual writer who lives in Hong Kong, and he met sent down youth when he was in China in the 70s studying himself. And he wrote this book, and he's appearing I'm writing the script based on 2 sources. He's going to be a character who's about to present at a symposium on the sent down youth. That's one track. And then you're going to have people discussing this as well as seeing those stories that are first-person accounts that Yufan made. And I'm going to juxtapose those stories so that you can see what's called the official, and there's unofficial, which is Fei Guanfang. I know I'm mispronouncing, right? This is my note. Yufan Wang's first-hand accounts are considered unofficial. Fei Guangfang, and they have never been published because they include accurate. See, what ended this was a hunger strike. And Bonin argues in his book that if it weren't for the sent down youth, there would have never been Tiananmen. There would have never been June 4th. This group led to that. And there were two major hunger strikes, one in Yunnan that ended it abruptly. Deng heard that people were dying, and he said, we got to end this. And he ended the sent down youth program in 1980. 17 million post-secondary and high school graduates were mandated to spend their prime years plowing. That's why they call them the lost generation, because they weren't allowed to go to school. They lost that ability. And let me just give you some facts, and then I'll finish this up. But this is, it's a Holocaust, really. Look, listen, you know how many grams they ate per day? Where is this? This is why I believe that once people hear about this, they're just going to go, I never knew that. Yeah, here we go. Oh, yeah. Millions of the sent-down youth lived on a ration of 20 kilograms of grain and a stipend of 28 yuan a month. They planted their own vegetables, lived in shacks. They built them in shacks they built themselves, and they competed with local ethnic minorities in order to survive. Rape and suicide were common. They stayed an average of 6 years and as long as 11 years. Most believed they would remain there for good. The experience scarred them for the rest of their lives, deprived the vast majority of a university education, and disrupted their family life and professional and marriage plans. They gave up many of the best years of their lives, and for what purpose? Anyways, that's a work in progress, but I'm working. Yo Fan died 3 months ago, but the book is being published, and I'm working with a professor who's working as like a final edit on these stories, and they're incredible. And most people have never read them because they hadn't been published. And the reason the film is animated, because Yo Fan never wanted any recognition, and he didn't want his family hurt, because we all know that things have been tightened. There is this official story. And as you mentioned, the Chinese, are using like surveillance. They have glasses. Did you hear about this? That the guy that stabbed somebody at a rock concert, the police, just using the artificial intelligence glasses, took about 45 minutes to identify this guy in a huge stadium, because they have everyone's face. And if you use WeChat, have you guys all seen the WeChat video thing on the New York Times about how the government is using WeChat for surveillance of everyone? It's an animated thing. You should just Google it and watch it. But they're using that to track. They're even scoring people. Some people they're not allowed to travel within China. Chinese people that have bought certain things or have not scored correctly in this proper way that Xi is moving China towards this kind of nationalistic, traditional mode. Anyways, that's what I'm working on. All right. And this is actually, let me show you that. This is a pre-drawing by an Iranian who's actually I'm working with. Crazy. Making a Chinese film with a guy who's from Iran, but he lives in Brooklyn. But I took 3 historical images. You know this famous image? Then I got an image of people with the red books, and the background he hasn't filled in. But I just gave him some direction, and he's been like, boom, just pumping out. It's going to look incredible. And this is one image but it's not fully realized, but it will be a solid film. Anyways, thank you.